Welcome to Music History Monday for July 15th, 2024. I'm Bob Greenberg, and the title for today's podcast is An Indispensable Person. If you haven't already, please consider joining me on my subscription site at patreon.com/RobertGreenbergMusic, where I blog, vlog, podcast, pontificate, review, and bloviate 4 to 6 times a week. Indispensability. The title of this blog, An Indispensable Person, might be considered controversial. That's because any number of very smart people would argue that there is, in fact, no such thing as an indispensable person. According to both Presidents Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, quote, "There is no indispensable man," unquote. Said President John F. Kennedy, quote, "Nobody's indispensable," unquote. Observed the redoubtable Charles de Gaulle, 1890 to 1970, quote, "The graveyards are full of indispensable men," unquote. And there we have it. There is a school of thought that states without equivocation that no one, absolutely no one, no matter how anyone has painted someone's existence or value, is indispensable. It's a school of thought that I do not attend. That's because, based on my reading of history, there are indeed certain individuals without whom certain positive historical ends could not have been achieved. Here are 4 obvious examples. James Thomas Flexner entitled his superb biography of George Washington, "The Indispensable Man," Plume, 1974. Flexner was correct in so titling his book because George Washington, 1732 to 1799, was, in fact, an indispensable person. Without his leadership and indomitable will, the American Revolution would have quickly unraveled and been lost. And without Washington, the American presidency, and with it the nascent American democracy, would very likely have devolved into autocracy, perhaps even monarchy. This Flexner biography of Washington should be required reading for a certain 6 members of our current not-so-terribly Supreme Court, who need desperately to be reminded of what the founders intended and what moral greatness looks like. We should all be loath to even consider what the United States would look like today if not for the indispensable moral guidance and eloquence of Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865. As for the 20th century, the world as we know it would not exist, and the forces of darkness might very well have triumphed without the indispensable Winston Churchill, 1874 to 1965, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945. As for the overly politically and socially sensitive among us, yes, I am aware that these are all white Protestant men. One of them a slave owner, Washington, one of them an imperialist, Churchill, and 3 of them members of the wealthy ruling class, Washington, Churchill, and Roosevelt. So what? Does that information in any way reduce their contributions to humanity? The Prussian general and military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, 1780 to 1831, pinpointed the traits that leaders require to make them indispensable. Quote, "2 qualities are indispensable. First, an intellect that, even in the darkest hour, retains some glimmerings of the inner light which leads to truth, and second, the courage to follow this faint light wherever it may lead," unquote. Okay, some perspective as we observe the obvious. The indispensable people of, say, the world of potash mining, of lip gloss manufacturing, and of shipping pallet design may not be as well known, and their impact on humanity not as universal as Washington, Lincoln, Churchill, and Roosevelt. But in terms of their fields, they are indispensable people as well. Without Howard T. Hallowell, 1877 to 1955, who patented the first shipping pallet in 1924, he called it a lift truck platform, the American trucking industry might never have gotten off the ground in the manner it did. Well, long live Howard T. Hallowell, the indispensable person of the shipping pallet. Another unsung hero, another indispensable person. We mark the death on July 15th, 1857, 167 years ago today, of the Austrian composer, pianist, chronicler of Beethoven, and teacher, Carl Czerny. For all his various and extraordinary contributions, Czerny must be considered an indispensable person to Western music during the first half of the 19th century. I would hazard that some might think I'm stretching the indispensable thing just a tad by including Carl Czerny on a list that just featured George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Howard T. Hallowell. But no, I'm not. Carl Czerny's impact on the piano, on piano playing, on piano music, on the teaching of the piano, on the pianists of the 19th century, and on Beethoven's scholarship, for reasons to be discussed momentarily, were not just decisive, but indispensable. All we need to do to establish Czerny's indispensable bona fides is ask ourselves, where would we be without him? What would we have done without him? Indeed. Let's talk. Czerny as teacher. Carl Czerny was one of the very best pianists of his time, though he has the dubious distinction of being the greatest pianist who, in his prime, never played in public. Okay, yes, as a young man, Czerny played in public a handful of times. For example, Beethoven entrusted the 21-year-old Czerny with the first public performance in Vienna of his Piano Concerto No. 5 in E-flat major, The Emperor, on February 12, 1812. But in fact, Czerny hated the pressure of performing in public, hated traveling, and felt that, quote, "my playing lacked the type of brilliant, calculated charlatanry that is usually part of a traveling virtuoso's essential equipment," unquote. Consequently, he stayed home in Vienna, where he performed in private, composed, and taught. He began teaching at the tender age of 15 and became the most important piano teacher of the 19th century. According to the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, Czerny was, quote, "a central figure in the transmission of Beethoven's legacy," unquote. A piano teacher who numbered among his star students some of the greatest pianists of the 19th century, including Stefan Heller, Sigismund Thalberg, Theodor Leschetizky, and Franz Liszt, 1811 to 1886. The story of Czerny's first meeting with Liszt, as told by Czerny himself, is wonderful. It was in late August of 1819 that Liszt's father, Adam, brought his then 7-year-old son to Czerny's teaching studio in Vienna. Czerny recalled, quote, "One morning in 1819, a man with a small boy approached me with a request to let the youngster play something on the piano. He was a pale, sickly-looking child who, while playing, swayed about on the stool as if drunk, so that I thought he might fall to the floor. His playing was also quite irregular, and he had so little idea of fingering that he threw his fingers quite arbitrarily around the keyboard. But that notwithstanding, I was astonished at the talent nature had bestowed upon him. He played something which I gave him to sight read like a pure natural. It was just the same when, at his father's request, I gave him a theme on which to improvise. Without the slightest knowledge of harmony, he still brought a touch of genius to his rendering. The father told me that he himself had taught the boy till now, but he asked me whether if I would myself accept his little Franzi. I told him I would be glad to." Unquote. Czerny later wrote of the young Liszt, quote, "Never before had I had so eager, talented, or industrious a student. After only a year, I could let him perform publicly, and he aroused a degree of enthusiasm in Vienna that few artists have equaled." Unquote. Czerny taught piano from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., giving 12 lessons a day. It was a workload he himself called, quote, "lucrative, but taxing," unquote. Lucre notwithstanding, Czerny insisted on teaching Franz Liszt for free, giving him his lessons every evening after having finished his long day's work. Liszt became a de facto member of the Czerny family, and he was grateful to Czerny, whom he always referred to, no matter how famous he got, as "my dear revered master," for the remainder of his life. Carl Czerny as composer. Czerny was a tireless composer who whipped out thousands of works, most of them for solo piano. His final opus number, meaning a published group of works, is a staggering opus 861. Harold Schoenberg describes Czerny's method of composing. Quote, "A skull cap on his head, he would work on 4 or 5 compositions simultaneously, running from one to the other as the ink dried enough for him to turn the pages, while carrying on an animated conversation with anybody who happened to be in the room." Unquote. While many of Czerny's works are pedagogical in nature, many are not, and his music, derided by lots of people who should know better, has been admired by some heavy hitters, including Igor Stravinsky, who wrote, quote, "As to Czerny, I have been appreciating the full-blooded musician in him more than the remarkable pedagogue." Unquote. As a pianist and composer for the piano, Czerny was singular in that his career straddled the era of the wooden-harped fortepiano and the metal-harped pianoforte. Like Mozart, 1756 to 1791, and Beethoven, 1770 to 1827, before him, Czerny reached his pianistic maturity playing lightweight, wooden-harped fortepianos manufactured in Vienna. Unlike Mozart and Beethoven, but like Frédéric Chopin, 1810 to 1849, and Franz Liszt, 1811 to 1886, Czerny attained a second pianistic plateau playing the new, more resonant, metal-harped pianos, mostly of French manufacture, that became the standard in the 1830s. A vast number of Czerny's piano compositions were studies for the new metal-harped double escapement action pianos, and they are employed by piano teachers to this very day. Czerny the Prodigy and Beethoven. Karl Czerny was born in the Leopoldstadt district of Vienna on February 21st, 1791. His father, Wenzel, was a professional pianist, organist, and oboist, and was young Karl's first piano teacher. He was a child prodigy who began playing the piano at 3, composing at 7, and made his public debut at 9 in 1800, performing Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 24 in C minor. That same year, 1800, Czerny began regular lessons with Beethoven, which continued until 1804 and occasionally thereafter. In 1805, Beethoven gave Czerny the following written recommendation, quote, "I, the undersigned, am glad to bear testimony to young Czerny having made the most extraordinary progress on the pianoforte, far beyond what might be expected at the age of 14. I consider him deserving of all possible assistance, not only because of what I have already referred to, but because of his astonishing memory," unquote. Yeah, Beethoven wasn't exaggerating when he referred to Czerny's astonishing memory. That memory allowed Czerny to memorize virtually every one of Beethoven's piano works. During the years 1804 and 1805, the 13 and 14-year-old Czerny performed Beethoven's music once or twice a week at the Viennese palace of Beethoven's patron, Prince Karl Lichnowsky. During these musicales, Lichnowsky would simply call out an opus number, and Czerny would perform the piece. For all of Czerny's magnificent pianism, his extraordinary and enduring influence as a teacher, and his countless compositions that as much as Chopin's and Liszt's defined the capabilities of the new metal-harped piano, it is Czerny's unvarnished memories of Beethoven that have made him entirely indispensable, a person we cannot do without. For example, here is Czerny's wonderful account of his first meeting and initial lesson with Beethoven. Quote, "I was about 10 years old when I was taken to Beethoven through the kind offices of Krumpholz." This would be Václav Krumpholz, 1750 to 1817, a Czech-born mandolin and violin player who introduced Czerny to Beethoven. It was the winter of 1799 to 1800. How I was overjoyed and terrified on the day when I was to meet the esteemed master. On a winter's day, my father, Krumpholz, and I walked from the Leopoldstadt, where we still lived, into the city, to the so-called Tiefer Graben, a street name, climbed up, as if in a tower, to the 5th or 6th floor, where a rather grubby-looking servant announced us to Beethoven and showed us in. A very barren-looking room, papers and clothes strewn all over the place, a few boxes, bare walls, hardly a single chair save for a rickety one by the piano, and a Walter fortepiano, at the time the best make, were there to be seen. In this room were gathered 6 to 8 persons, including the violinist Schuppanzig and one of Beethoven's brothers. Beethoven himself was dressed in a jacket of some shaggy dark gray cloth and trousers of the same material, so that he immediately reminded me of Robinson Crusoe, which I had just then read. The coal-black hair, cut a la Titus, stood up around his head. His black beard, unshaven for several days, darkened the lower part of his already dark-complexioned face. Also, I noticed at a glance, as children are wont to do, that his ears were stuffed with cotton wool, which seems to have been dipped in some yellow fluid. Yet at that time, not the slightest sign of deafness was apparent. I had to play something immediately, and since I was too shy to begin with one of his compositions, I played Mozart's great C major concerto, Koelschel 503, which begins with chords. Beethoven was immediately attentive. He came close to my chair and played with his left hand the orchestra part of those sections where I had only accompanying passages. His hands were very hairy, and his fingers, especially at the tips, very broad. He expressed himself as being satisfied, so I made bold and played his Pathétique piano sonata, which had then just appeared. When I had finished, Beethoven turned to my father and said, "The boy has talent. I will teach him myself and accept him as my pupil. Send him to me a few times a week. Before anything else, obtain for him a Manuel Bach's handbook on the proper way to play the clavier, meaning keyboard, so he can bring it with him the next time he comes." In the first lessons, Beethoven gave me scales in every key, showed me the only proper position of the hands and of the fingers, and particularly the use of the thumb, then unknown to the majority of players, rules whose complete scope I mastered only at a much later time. Then he went over the exercises of the handbook with me and drew my attention to legato, meaning smooth singing playing, of which he himself was an unequaled master, and which at that time all other pianists believed to be impossible to obtain on the forte piano. At that time, dating still from Mozart's days, the clipped and staccato way of playing was the fashion." Unquote. My friends, as recollections go, that one is priceless. Czerny remained a close friend and observer of Beethoven's for the rest of Beethoven's life. Czerny even gave piano lessons to Beethoven's nephew Karl. His reminiscences of Beethoven are, in a word, indispensable. Last will and testament. As we might expect for someone with 861 publications, Karl Czerny made a lot of money. Unfortunately, he had no one to leave it to when he died in Vienna on July 15, 1857, 167 years ago today. He never married and had no brothers or sisters or any other near relatives, just cats, 7 to 10 of them at any given time. So he willed his fortune to a number of different charities and performance organizations, including the Society of Friends of Music in Vienna, to his housekeeper, and, in honor of Beethoven, to a charity for the deaf. Thank you. To sample and download one or all of my many courses on subjects musical produced by the Great Courses / The Teaching Company, please visit my website at robertgreenbergmusic.com.